You fit the description, ma'am. The click of cold metal closing around her wrist sounded louder than it should have in the open air, like something final, something heavier than a simple mistake. And for a brief second the entire parking lot seemed to hold its breath as Deputy Ryan Cole straightened his posture, jaw tight, radio crackling faintly against his shoulder, while late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the cracked asphalt, glinting off windshields and the faded blue handicap lines beneath their feet. And in front of him stood Evelyn Carter, 72 years old, her frame small beneath a worn beige coat, her other hand resting lightly against a canvas tote that had seen too many seasons, its fabric softened by years of use. The kind of bag that carried groceries, prescriptions, quiet routines, and pieces of a life that never asked for attention. Yet now every eye in the lot seemed drawn to her, pulled by the tension that hung between authority and something far more fragile, far more human. As a shopping cart rolled slowly across the pavement somewhere behind them, its loose wheel rattling in uneven rhythm, a distant engine idling, a child's voice fading into silence as even the smallest movements seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the moment, and Ryan's grip tightened just enough to assert control, not forceful, not violent, but firm in the way someone believed certainty was on their side, his training echoing louder than instinct, louder than doubt, because this was his first solo shift, his first chance to prove he could read a situation, act decisively, be the kind of officer who didn't hesitate, who didn't second-guess, who didn't let something slip through his fingers. And yet standing this close, he could see the fine tremor in Evelyn's hand, not from fear, but from age, from years lived quietly, steadily, her skin lined like folded paper that had weathered time with patience rather than resistance. And still she didn't pull away, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with eyes that held something deeper than confusion, something softer than fear, as if she were searching his face not for permission, not for mercy, but for recognition, for a memory that hadn't yet surfaced. And the breeze shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of motor oil and warm pavement, brushing against the edge of a loose envelope tucked halfway out of her bag, its corner worn and creased, fluttering just enough to catch the light before settling again, unnoticed, as Ryan glanced briefly at the small crowd beginning to form at a distance, phones half raised, whispers barely contained, and his shoulders squared. Instinctively, reinforcing the role he believed he needed to play, the line he could not afford to cross backward, even if something about this moment felt off in a way he couldn't quite name, while Evelyn's voice, when it finally came, was calm, steady, almost gentle against the tension pressing in from every side, a quiet presence that didn't resist the moment but didn't surrender to it either, as if she understood something he didn't yet, something waiting just beneath the surface, something that hadn't revealed itself, not yet. The wind shifted again, softer this time, brushing a loose strand of gray hair across Evelyn Carter's cheek as she adjusted her stance ever so slightly, careful not to disturb the grip around her wrist, her movements measured, deliberate, like someone who had learned long ago that calm could carry more weight than resistance. And Ryan noticed it. Even if he did not want to, the absence of panic, the absence of anger. It unsettled him in a way loud protests never did, because it left him alone with his own certainty, forcing him to examine it more closely than he was prepared for. And yet he held his ground, shoulders squared, eyes scanning her face for signs that would confirm what he believed, something to justify the moment that was now unfolding under the watch of strangers and quiet judgment. But all he found was patience, the kind that did not rush to correct him, the kind that waited. And that made something in his chest tighten just slightly, almost unnoticeably, as if a question had formed but had not yet found words, while Evelyn's gaze moved past him for a second, toward the far edge of the parking lot where a grocery store sign flickered, faintly in the late afternoon light, its hum barely audible beneath the low murmur of onlookers, and she seemed to take that small sound in, grounding herself in something steady, something familiar, before returning her attention to him with the same quiet composure, her voice when it came again low but clear, not challenging, not defensive, simply present. "Officer, I was just picking up my prescription," and the words hung there, simple, unembellished, yet they carried the weight of ordinary life interrupted, A routine broken by a moment that had grown larger than it needed to be, and Ryan's grip loosened by a fraction, not enough to release her, but enough to register that something was shifting, something inside him that did not align with the rigid outline he had built in his mind. And still he pushed forward, asking for identification, for explanation, for anything that would bring the situation back into a structure he understood, while Evelyn slowly reached toward her bag. With her free hand, careful, deliberate, every movement visible, every gesture transparent, as if she knew that clarity was the only language he would accept right now. And as her fingers brushed the edge of the worn canvas, that same envelope slipped a little further out, its surface catching the sunlight more fully this time, revealing faint ink that had begun to fade with age, a name written across it in careful, practiced handwriting, though Ryan did not look down, not yet, his attention fixed on procedure, on steps, on doing things the right way. Even as something deeper began to stir beneath that surface, something tied to memory, to recognition, to a past he had not considered in years, and around them the air seemed to thicken again, not with tension alone, but with anticipation, as if the moment itself was waiting for something to be seen, something small but undeniable, something that would change the direction of everything without a single raised voice. And Evelyn, still standing there with quiet dignity, seemed to already know it was coming. Ryan's fingers hovered just above the edge of the envelope now, his attention finally pulled downward by something quieter than suspicion but stronger than routine, a subtle pull that did not come from training manuals or radio calls, but from a place he had not listened to in years. And as Evelyn Carter held the canvas bag steady, her hand open, visible, her posture unchanged, he hesitated for the first time since the moment had begun. Not a dramatic pause, not something anyone else would notice, but enough for the rhythm of the scene to shift, enough for the silence to stretch just a fraction longer than before, and in that space his eyes caught the handwriting, faded but deliberate, each letter formed with care, the ink softened by time, yet still legible, still present, and something about it felt familiar in a way that did not immediately make sense, as if it belonged to a memory that had been tucked away rather than erased, while the sounds around them seemed to dull, the low murmur of voices blending into the hum of distant traffic, the world narrowing until it was just the envelope, the name, and the quiet woman standing in front of him. And he reached for it slowly, not as an officer retrieving evidence, but as someone drawn toward an answer he did not yet understand, his grip on her wrist loosening further without him realizing it, until the contact was no longer control but habit, and Evelyn did not move away, did not interrupt. She simply watched him with that same steady gaze, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, as if everything before had been leading here, and when his fingers finally touched the edge of the envelope, he felt the slight roughness of the paper, the softened crease along its fold, the physical proof that it had been carried, kept, protected, not for a day or a week, but for something much longer, and he pulled it free just enough to see the full name written across the front, Ryan Cole, and the sight of it landed with a weight that was not loud but undeniable, a quiet impact that did not need sound to be felt, and his breath caught in a way he could not control, his mind searching, flipping through fragments, glimpses of places and faces that had not surfaced in years, a small kitchen with chipped countertops, the faint smell of laundry soap, a voice humming softly somewhere in the background, the warmth of a presence that had once meant safety without needing explanation. And for a second he stood there caught between the present and something unfinished from the past, unable to fully place it yet unable to ignore it anymore. While Evelyn's voice came again, softer now, almost like a memory itself. You used to hold on to things like that when you were nervous. And the words did not accuse, did not correct, they simply existed, and that made them heavier, more real, because they did not demand recognition, they allowed it, and Ryan's grip fell away completely this time, his hand dropping back to his side, as if the act of holding on no longer made sense, as if control itself had quietly lost its footing, and he looked at her again, really looked this time, past the coat, past the age, past the moment he had constructed, searching for the connection that was now just within reach, but not fully clear, and the air between them shifted once more, no longer tight with authority but fragile with realization, as if the truth was standing right there, waiting patiently to be seen. The name lingered in his mind longer than it should have, not as a label, but as a thread pulling something loose inside him. And Ryan's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope, not in control this time, but in uncertainty, as if the paper itself carried a weight he had not expected. And he glanced up again at Evelyn Carter, really studying her now, the fine lines around her eyes, the calm in her expression, the absence of urgency, and something about it did not match the situation he had constructed just minutes ago. Something about her did not belong in the version of events he had been so sure of. And the longer he looked, the more that certainty began to thin, like a reflection losing its shape in moving water, while the crowd at the edge of the parking lot remained still, quieter now, sensing the shift even if they did not understand it, their presence no longer feeding tension but witnessing something unravel. And Ryan swallowed once, his throat dry, his training offering. No guidance for this kind of moment, no checklist for recognition. No protocol for when the past quietly steps into the present without warning. And he turned the envelope slightly, his eyes scanning the faded ink again, confirming what he had already seen, his name written in a hand that felt deliberate, familiar in a way that was just out of reach. And Evelyn's voice came again, not louder, not pressing, but steady, patient. "I kept that for you," she said, and the words settled into the air between them, simple yet layered with meaning. And Ryan blinked, the sentence landing differently than anything else she had said, not defensive, not explanatory, but personal, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to file away as coincidence or misunderstanding, because it did not belong to this moment alone. It belonged to something older, something that had been carried forward quietly until now. And his mind moved again, searching, not with urgency, but with a growing sense that he was late to something important, that he had missed a step somewhere along the way. And fragments surfaced more clearly this time. A small living room with sunlight coming through thin curtains, a plate set carefully on a table, a voice calling his name not as an officer, but as a child, softer, warmer, and he felt his posture shift without realizing it, the rigid line of authority easing into something less certain, less defined, while his hand dropped fully away from her wrist. The contact gone now, not replaced, not resumed, just absent, and he took a small step back, not retreating but creating space, as if he needed distance to see more clearly, to understand what was unfolding in front of him. And Evelyn did not move forward to close that space. She remained where she was, grounded, composed, allowing him the room he needed to catch up to a truth she had already accepted. And the envelope, still in his hand, felt less like evidence and more like a message waiting to be opened, something that had been patient long enough, something that would not remain hidden much longer. And as Ryan looked at her again, the question in his eyes was no longer about suspicion. It was about memory, about connection, about how a moment that began with certainty had turned into something far more fragile, something that could not be controlled, only understood. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with everything that had not yet been said. And Ryan stood there with the envelope in his hand, the edges pressing lightly into his palm, as if grounding him in a reality that was shifting faster than he could process. His thoughts no longer aligned in straight lines but scattered, circling back to fragments that refused to stay buried. And he finally spoke, though his voice lacked the sharp authority it had carried before. "How do you know my name?" The question coming out slower than intended, more uncertain than he would have allowed just minutes earlier. And Evelyn Carter did not answer right away, not because she could not, but because she did not rush moments like this. She let them settle, let them breathe, her eyes steady on his as if giving him the space to hear his own question more clearly. And when she did speak, it was gentle, almost reflective. "Because I used to say it every morning before you left for school." And the words did not rise, did not fall. They simply existed, and that made them impossible to ignore, because they did not demand belief. They invited recognition. And something inside Ryan shifted more noticeably now. Not a sudden break, but a quiet collapse of the certainty he had been standing on. And he blinked again, his gaze dropping briefly to the envelope, then back to her face, searching for something concrete, something undeniable. And the memory came in pieces at first. A pair of worn sneakers by the door, a lunch packed carefully in a paper bag, a voice reminding him not to forget his jacket when the mornings were cold. And he could almost hear it now, layered beneath her present tone, the same calm, the same warmth, unchanged by time. And his posture softened without permission, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal that something had shifted beyond his control. While the people around them remained quiet, their earlier curiosity replaced with a kind of stillness that often follows when something personal unfolds in a public space. And Ryan took a slow breath, deeper than the ones before, as if trying to steady himself against the realization forming in front of him. And he shook his head slightly, not in denial but in disbelief. "That does not make sense," he said, though the words lacked conviction, more an attempt to hold on to the last piece of certainty he had left. And Evelyn's expression did not change. She did not correct him, did not push. She simply reached into her bag again, slow, deliberate, her movements careful not to startle. And this time she pulled out something smaller, a photograph, its edges worn, its surface slightly faded, and she held it out toward him without stepping closer, allowing him to choose whether to take it. And for a second he hesitated, the distance between them feeling larger than it physically was, filled with everything he had yet to understand. And then he reached forward, his fingers brushing against hers briefly as he took the photograph, and the contact was light, almost nothing. But it carried a weight he could not explain. And he looked down, his eyes focusing on the image, and there it was, clearer now than any fragment, a younger version of himself, smaller, standing beside a woman who looked different in years but not in presence, her posture the same, her expression the same, her eyes carrying that same quiet steadiness. And the realization did not arrive with noise, it arrived with stillness, settling into him slowly but completely, leaving no room for doubt. And for the first time since the moment began, Ryan did not look like someone in control of a situation. He looked like someone who had just found a piece of his own story in the hands of someone he had almost overlooked. The photograph trembled slightly in Ryan's hand, not from the wind but from something deeper, something internal that he could not steady. And the edges of the image seemed sharper now, more defined against the fading light, as if the past itself had stepped forward with clarity he was not prepared to face. And his eyes moved slowly across the picture again, tracing the outline of the boy he used to be. The way his shoulders had been smaller, his expression softer, untouched by the weight of authority he now carried. And beside that boy stood Evelyn, younger, stronger, but unmistakably the same, her posture grounded, her presence calm, her eyes holding that same quiet certainty that now stood in front of him again, unchanged by time. And the memory did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, like a door opening gradually after years of being closed. And with it came sounds, sensations, moments he had not thought about in a long time, the clatter of dishes in a small kitchen, the low hum of a radio playing somewhere in the background, the warmth of a voice that spoke his name not with command but with care. And he felt his breath slow, not intentionally, but because something inside him needed space to catch up, needed time to understand what had just surfaced. While around them the parking lot seemed to fade further into the background, the distant voices quieter now, the earlier tension replaced with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as if the space itself recognized that something important was unfolding, something that did not belong to the present alone. And Ryan lowered the photograph slightly, his gaze lifting back to Evelyn, his expression no longer guarded but searching, vulnerable in a way he had not allowed himself to be in years. And for a moment he said nothing, because there were no words that could bridge the distance between what he had believed just minutes ago and what he now understood. And Evelyn did not rush him. She did not fill the silence. She simply stood there, steady, patient, allowing him to move through the realization at his own pace. And that patience carried a weight of its own, not demanding, not accusing, but present in a way that could not be ignored. And Ryan finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority that had defined it earlier. "I remember," he said, though the words felt incomplete, too small for what was happening. And yet they were all he could manage in that moment, because memory was not just recognition, it was responsibility. It was understanding the gap between who he had been and who he had become, and the realization settled heavier than anything else had so far, because it did not just change the situation, It changed him, even if only slightly, even if only in this moment. And his shoulders lowered further, the rigid line of his posture giving way to something more human, something less certain, and he glanced again at the envelope still in his other hand, the one she had kept, the one that had carried his name through years he had not thought to revisit. And he understood now that this was not a coincidence, not a mistake. This was something that had been waiting, something that had found its way back to him at a moment when he needed to see it, even if he did not know he did. And Evelyn's voice came once more, soft but steady. "You were a good boy, Ryan," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no comparison, just a statement of truth from a time that still existed in her memory. And that made it harder to hear, harder to reconcile, because it asked a question without asking it directly. It asked him to consider what had changed, and for a moment he stood there, caught between the past she remembered and the present he had just created, feeling the weight of both pressing quietly against him, with no place left to hide. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, and Ryan felt them more than he heard them. The sentence lingering in the space between them as if it had always been there waiting for him to catch up. And for a moment he could not meet her eyes, not because he did not want to, but because he was no longer sure what they would reflect back at him. And the photograph in his hand felt different now. No longer just a memory, but a mirror, one that showed him a version of himself he had not measured up to in this moment. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came from deeper than habit, as if something inside him was loosening, releasing a tension he had not even realized he was holding, while the faint hum of the grocery store sign flickered again in the distance, grounding the moment in something ordinary even as everything about it felt anything but. And he finally looked up, his gaze steadier now but softer, less guarded. And when he spoke his voice carried something unfamiliar, something closer to honesty than authority. "I did not recognize you," he said, and the admission hung there without defense, without justification, just truth. And Evelyn Carter nodded once, not in agreement, not in correction, but in understanding, as if she had expected nothing less, as if recognition had never been the point. And that realization shifted something else inside him, something that reached beyond memory into meaning. And his hand moved instinctively, lowering the photograph, then the envelope, until both rested at his side, no longer held with tension but with care, as if he understood now that they were not objects to control, but pieces of something he had been given, something he had nearly overlooked. And he glanced briefly toward the small crowd still gathered at a distance, their presence quiet now, no longer curious but attentive, witnessing a moment that had changed direction without raising its voice. And for the first time since this began, Ryan became aware of them not as an audience, but as a reflection, a reminder that what he had done had been seen, that this moment did not exist in isolation. And that realization settled into him with a weight that was steady, not crushing but undeniable. And he turned back to Evelyn, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, but open in a way that made him look younger for just a second, closer to the boy in the photograph than the officer he had tried to be. And his hand lifted slightly, then stopped, unsure, not reaching out, not retreating, caught in that space where intention had to choose its direction. And Evelyn did not move to fill it. She remained still, her presence unchanged, allowing him to find that direction on his own. And in that quiet, something became clear to him, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady understanding that had been building since the moment he saw his name on that envelope. That this was not about being right or wrong in a single decision. It was about something deeper, something that reached into the way he saw people, the way he acted before he understood, and the way he carried his authority without always questioning it. And he swallowed once, the motion small but meaningful, as if acknowledging that understanding without needing to say it aloud. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more grounded. "I should not have done that," he said, not specifying, not explaining, because he did not need to. The moment spoke for itself, and Evelyn's expression softened just slightly, not in approval, not in relief, but in something quieter, something closer to recognition of its own. And the air between them felt different now, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but settled into a kind of stillness that carried its own form of truth, one that did not need to be repeated to be understood. Ryan's words did not disappear into the air. They stayed there, steady and exposed. And for a moment it felt as though the entire parking lot leaned into that silence, not waiting for more explanation, but recognizing that something honest had finally been placed between them, something that could not be taken back or reshaped. And Evelyn Carter held his gaze with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. Her expression unchanged, yet somehow softer at the edges, not because the moment had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged, and that difference mattered in a way that did not need to be spoken. And she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if accepting the weight of what he had said without turning it into something larger. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded. "What matters is what you do next," she said, and the sentence settled differently than anything before it. Not tied to the past, but pointing forward, shifting the moment from realization into responsibility. And Ryan felt that shift immediately, the words landing not as instruction but as direction, something that asked for action rather than reflection. And he straightened slightly, not returning to the rigid posture he had before, but finding a new balance, one that felt less about control and more about presence. And he glanced down at the envelope and photograph in his hands, then carefully placed them back into her bag, his movements slower now, deliberate, as if each action carried meaning beyond itself. And when he looked up again, there was no hesitation left in his expression, only a quiet determination that had replaced the earlier certainty. And he reached to his belt, his fingers moving with purpose, and then stopped for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, as if understanding the significance of even this simple motion. And then he removed the cuff from her wrist, the metal releasing with a soft click that sounded different this time, lighter, as though it belonged to a different moment entirely. And he stepped back, creating space not out of distance but out of respect. And Evelyn lowered her hand slowly, her movement steady, unaffected, as if the physical release was only a small part of something much larger that had already shifted. And the people at the edge of the lot began to move again, quietly, their presence dissolving back into the rhythm of the day, some lowering their phones, others turning away, the moment no longer something to capture, but something to carry with them in silence. And Ryan noticed it, the way attention faded when tension was replaced with understanding, and it settled into him as another layer of awareness, another reminder that what had happened did not disappear just because it had changed direction. And he looked at Evelyn again, his voice quieter now but steady. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were simple, unadorned, but they carried a weight that came from being fully meant, not as an attempt to resolve everything, but as a step towards something better. And Evelyn's eyes held his for a moment longer, searching not for perfection but for sincerity. And whatever she saw there was enough, because she gave another small nod, not forgiving, not dismissing, but acknowledging that the moment had shifted in the only way it could, through truth, through choice, through the quiet decision to do better when it mattered most. The moment did not end with words. It dissolved into something quieter, something that lingered long after the sound of his apology faded into the open air. And Ryan Cole stood there for a second, longer than necessary, as if his body had not yet caught up with the shift that had already taken place inside him, his hands now empty, no longer holding authority, no longer holding assumption, just still at his sides as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting a softer light across the parking lot, turning the hard edges of the scene into something warmer, something less defined. And Evelyn Carter adjusted the strap of her canvas bag gently over her shoulder, the envelope and photograph, now tucked safely inside again, not as evidence, not as proof, but as something personal, something that had done its work without needing to be explained. And she looked at him one last time, her expression calm, unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that carried forward, not forgiveness, not judgment, but a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. And then she turned, her steps steady and unhurried as she began to walk toward the store entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft mechanical hum, welcoming her back into the simple rhythm of the day she had started before any of this had happened. And Ryan watched her go, not because he had to, but because something in him needed to see the end of the moment fully, needed to understand what it meant for someone to walk away without anger, without demand, carrying dignity in a way he had not recognized until now. And the sounds of the parking lot slowly returned, engines starting, carts rolling, conversations picking back up in low voices, life resuming as it always did. But for him it did not feel the same, not entirely, because the weight of what had happened remained, not heavy in a way that crushed him, but present in a way that would not easily fade. And he glanced down at his hands again, as if expecting to see something different there, some visible mark of the shift he felt. But there was nothing, just the same uniform, the same badge, the same responsibility, only now. It felt altered, not in appearance, but in meaning, and he took a slow breath, deeper than before, the air cooler now as the day edged toward evening, and he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the lot, not scanning for problems, not searching for control, but noticing, really noticing the people moving through it, the small details he had overlooked earlier, the quiet exchanges, the ordinary lives unfolding without interruption. And for the first time since he had put on that uniform, he understood that authority was not just about action. It was about awareness, about restraint, about seeing before deciding. And the realization did not come with pride. It came with humility, settling into him in a way that felt lasting. And somewhere in the distance, the faint flicker of the store sign steadied into a constant glow, no longer blinking, no longer uncertain, just present. And Ryan stood there for another moment, letting the silence speak where words no longer needed to, before finally turning toward his patrol car, his steps measured, not rushed, carrying with him something invisible yet undeniable, something that would follow him long after this day ended, something that did not need to be repeated to be remembered,